I hear when we go all over the country about all folks have problems with Tennessee land. Some time ago we thought about we needed to talk about this. This is not a complicated issue. People have been platting land ever since we had land. I understand we have at least one surveyor with us. Do we have anybody else who surveys for a living? Okay, so be kind to me, because we actually are going to do the easy thing. I mean, I know how to hold a pole, but we won't be doing that. We're only going to be looking at deeds, and I'll give you simple ones. And this is really a basic understanding of metes and bounds, and how to look at the deeds and how to look at the grants. And then more importantly, I'll show you how to do it in a basic way. You should be able to, if you'll repeat this, don't wait too long to try. When you get home, next day or two, try it again. Pull out some of those deeds that you haven't used in a while. Do it again. And I think you'll honestly understand this concept. It is not a difficult concept. It's only hard. I forgot who walked in and said, "Oh, protractors?" Okay. So, yeah, I do understand that, the concept of having math on a Saturday morning. But I'll try to make the math part easy, okay? However, in Tennessee, it is a mistake to ignore the land, whether your ancestors owned it, leased it, lived on it, squatted on it, or any of the other. Because land is an essential part of understanding how our ancestors lived and still live today. Because if you don't have land issues, or if you have farming issues, then understanding what the lay of the land looks like is very determinant of why folks came into this beautiful, verdant, green valley. If it's the valley, the mountaintop. Now, how many of you are not from Tennessee? You're still welcome. Still welcome this morning. But understanding the aspect of why we claim land as such an important tool, I think you'll understand very clearly. As I teach over the country, one of the first things that I talk about is water and how essential water is, because we know that today, and your kids know, and your grandkids know, that all they have to do is one of two things: walk to the refrigerator and take out a bottle, or put a glass under a tap or a water filtered system that you have. If you're a slightly older, and I'm going to put myself in that category, the house where I was born in did not have running water. Now, where the water came from was essentially important. And if you look back in records, that's why we had typhoid epidemics in the past. That's why we had cholera epidemics. The understanding of a good, clear water system. And by the way, it's why Tennessee has the best whiskey in the world, okay? Because we filter it twice. In Kentucky, they don't. They just call it bourbon. Okay, I'm a little prejudiced there, but hey, okay, all right. So let's start with the basics. It's just like math class for a little bit. Let's get this out of the way. I want you to look at the ruler that you have, and they're going to be different than the ones here because I've given you more traditional rulers that actually have broken into 8ths and 16ths. Sometimes I try to use rulers that are only 1/10 of an inch, but it doesn't matter. Just look at your ruler. It's just like probably the one you had back in elementary school. Okay? All right. I think the biggest issue, as I heard people selecting, was the color of the ruler as opposed to its utilitarian features. Number one, okay, so it's marked. I just want you to look at the ruler. Secondly, I want you to think about, and you don't have to do this, but in your position that you are, I want you to take your ruler and your pencil on a piece of blank paper that I gave you or on the back of your handout or around the edge, it doesn't matter, to draw a line that is 2.3 inches long, okay? And by the way, if you need help from a neighbor, just ask them. It's all right. 2.3, 2 3/10. It's a little harder. If you have the 10th ruler, it makes it a little simpler, but I want you to be thinking just in the concept of how do we use an English measure ruler to do this, okay? All right. So roughly there is everybody do well with that? Okay, now that may sound a bit ridiculous, but the concept is this is where folks have problems. It has nothing to do with when we get to the issue of platting. It has the issue of taking a piece of information and putting it on paper. That really seems to be the hardest part. My friend told me last night to remind you that she believes the hardest part for most folks is reading a deed and then reading the calls and information off correctly. So I'm going to try to resolve that. I'll show you how we do that in a systematic way. Okay?
Probably a little bit over 5/16.
Let's see. All right. A little bit over 5/16. He's telling you what that time. All right. Now, this one, I just want to see if you can think. Do you remember in school where you had to fold those boxes that were flat and they had lines on them and then you had to tell what it looked like at the end? This is kind of that class. So if you weren't great with that, just stay calm. I want you to draw 2 lines, either virtual or exact. One is 3.2 inches long. One is 2.7 inches long, and I want them to meet at a 45-degree angle. I know, that's 2 things at once, or three things.
So this is separate from the first line you had.
Yeah, well, you can use that other line if you want to, since you've already drawn it. So I want one of them to be 3.2 inches long, one to be 2.7 inches long, and I want them to meet at a 45-degree angle. Now, just think, you have a protractor. You might know what a 45-degree angle is without doing it. I'm not going to double check it. Don't have to turn in homework yet. I'll say yet, because at some point Donna might say, let me see those things up close. But the whole thing about research, as you're looking at deeds and documents, is that often the mistakes we made are caused by just slight oversights or mathematical errors or a slight drawing error. So the more precise you are with these simple processes, the more precise your plat will be when you actually get to the point of drawing it. All right, well, it should look roughly like that. Roughly. All right? Okay, so if you've done that, pat on the back, good job. Our ancestors, so this is going to move us into land, understand the value and importance of this. And it was often, if they were given land through an inheritance or a grant or an opportunity to come here or buy land, it was the most important purchase they made. And there's a lot in the process of that where we won't go into the details, but land's importance to a family is still true today because, at least in this state, the number of families who have retained land that was given to them in the time of independence, which after the Revolution, that still hold their farms today is amazing numbers, okay? That the land stays within a farm for a period of time. Even 10 years seems like a long time now, but to say 100 or 200 years is a bit amazing. And so know that often folks have done that. Now, generally, if you're going to do this at home, you'll have a few more supplies. This is included in your handout. Don't feel like you have to jot all this down. It'll make sense. But the most important issues would be a protractor. And there are land protractors. I'll be demonstrating. The one in your handout is a full round. It's not necessary. The one that I have you, which is just a normal school protractor, will work. We'll show you how to use that. A ruler. And actually, shorter ones work fine. Doesn't have to be full 12 inches. 6-inch ones does great. A calculator. Because if we're going to plat this to generally fit what we call a topographic map or any other map, they're smaller. Because actually the size, we'll talk about that, the size of this room, for example, if we were to plat this room 1-to-1, 1 foot is 1 foot, then we would have a drawing the same size as this room. Does that make sense? So in reality, you don't have that much paper, okay? So we would do what we would say to scale. And so we may need a calculator, unless you're really good with mathematics and arithmetic and you do algebra in your head. We can do those works with a calculator to calculate the scale, okay? We can use grid paper or plain paper, and what you have today is just plain bond paper, okay? Now when we get later, I'll show you an example of how to use the mylar or polyester of drawing the plat and taking it to another thing. And I'll show you an example of how we take this to the next step to find land. We won't have time to actually do that all ourselves, but you will plat today. A topographic map, we'll talk about that, and a pencil. And that's why I brought the little lead pencils. I brought some regular number 2 pencils back there too. Somebody had to draw those probably. The preciseness of that is generally, if you actually know somebody who does surveying by hand or by pencil anymore, they use very precise small pencils because everything affects the final drawing. So big lead is not to scale, the smaller lead and preciseness, but a small one with a sharp lead will work. So we're in good shape, okay? Now you have most of that of what you need in your handout. On the front, I've given you the land measures, the typical ones, in addition to even what we talk about here, but everyone, in the ones we're going to look at today, we will refer to acres, we'll refer to a perch, a pole, and a rod, all of which are the same level, 16.5 feet. So you have these. If you need to cut that out, paste it somewhere, keep it. Whenever you're working with your deeds, this becomes your new reference of how far is that? How long is that? Because it's not a term, it is a term we use all the time. If you work in land, you're used to it. But if you're not going to do that, because today we use feet and inches or yards, if you need the conversion, there's all the information, okay? So it'd be nice to know that and that you'll have that in front of you at all times. Okay, let's talk about scale. And we talked about if it was the size of this room, 1-to-1, or so if you're doing an acre, it would be an acre-sized piece of paper. That's not very practical for us to record it. And historically, when we look at the plats for land, plats for grants, sometimes if you've actually done this, and I hope you have, looked at some of the North Carolina grants, and there's a small plat drawn right there on the warrant or on the grant itself. There's a little picture at the top, maybe about this big. Well, obviously the land is bigger than that, right? But it's a representation by scale of that. That's called a plat. And we will plot that plat. We will draw that. That was drawn by someone based on the information at the time. Most of us use what's called the topographic maps that represent 24,000 inches. 1 inch of land equals 24,000 inches. So instead of it being 24,000 inches, we make it an inch on the map. And those are the topographic maps that are in wide use. There are others. We have the 7.5 maps. But to do that, the ratio of 1 to 24,000, and that will be based on what you see on a map. If you're going to use a property tax map using the assessor of property maps in some of the counties, then they're at a different scale, okay? So it's more like 900 feet to an inch. But usually look on the map. The ones that are online at the Assessor of Property website, it tells you what the scale is. So if you're trying to match it to a modern piece of property, that's a different scale than the topographic maps. Okay, I see that. Okay, I see that glaze already. Bear with me. We'll make it clear. We'll make it clear. Well, I'll try to make it clear, okay? What you see in the math there, and I share that otherwise, is if a pole equals 16.5 feet, so you don't have to know this to plat. I'm just telling you this for those of you that are control freaks like me. That you want to know everything, I'm telling you anyway, okay? The rest of you can kind of just smile and enjoy for a second. If the scale of the map is 1 inch equals 24,000 inches, or 2,000 feet, then we're going to do what we did the cross multiply back in 6th grade. Okay? 1 pole equals 16.5 feet times 2,000 feet over 1 inch equals 1 inch equals, then you divide, 121 poles. So if we want to make it fit a topographic map, we divide the number of poles in the deed. 1 inch of those is 121. So it's 1 inch equals 121 poles. I know my surveyors are like, yes, why are you telling them this? But you got my point, right? No, but you'll see it again. And those maps, just to confuse things a little more, when we look at the topographic maps that we use, which is the largest number of maps that we use for platting genealogical research projects, they're called 7.5-minute maps, okay? And their reasoning, somebody says, it's how far you can walk in 7.5 minutes. That's not quite true. Flyover, they're originally done, and they were called a flyover grid, 7.5 minutes. They're commonly called 7.5-minute quadrangle maps. And they're available by quadrangle name. And if you're not familiar with these at all, in your handout, I referred you to a place called TopoZone, where you can look at all the topographic maps at the U.S. Genealogical Service for all of those. Did I say Genealogical Service?
You did.
Okay, oh well. I wish there was a U.S. Genealogical Service, but the maps have been done historically and continue to be updated. And there are places where you can actually look up the historical topographic maps for comparison. You got to make sure they're the same scale, and there are some changes of those. We can actually go back and look back to the 1950s fairly easily. The aerial photos began in the 20th centuries. So that's one of the sites, historicalmaptech.com is one of the sites that has historical topographic maps available. Okay. Now in Tennessee, a large number of them are available by section. I wanted to highlight this for a second. This is the University of Tennessee online historic topographic maps, and they're expanding it. So you just type, you can look for those. The counties that are in dark green are already available, and they're expanding that fairly quickly. So there are multiple places. Yeah, that's the one that's in your handout. I just want to highlight the Tennessee things occasionally too. So did you hear that? USGS now has all historical maps online for free, and that's the link that's in your handout, links to that. I checked it again last night. But the thought is you have to choose a quadrangle, and that was the example here. Choosing a quadrangle of where you want to look, and they're named typically like that, like Jefferson City, White Pine, Chestnut Hill. This is in the East Tennessee area, so remember that. Now, this is extra material you don't need, but I want you to go home and play with this more. His point is exactly there. What was there yesterday and what there's today is different. There's more information available to you today than has ever been there before. So I want you to take access to look at that, find out what's here and otherwise. Now we're going to change our terms. I want you to do just a little different. We're going to talk about scale. Now I want you to plat or draw a boundary line that is 8 chains long. 8 chains long. Use a scale of 1 inch equals 2 chains. Don't need a calculator for that one.
Some of us go back to slide rule days, pre-calculator.
Well, yeah, that's true. He's saying, and actually when I first started doing this, I used a slide rule for all calculations then. So yeah, we could be using slide rules. Not for this one, but hey. All right, so how long is that going to be? 4 inches. Okay, everybody gets a star. And I provided the additional information there of showing how I would do the scale, and you know the math. So I'm going to provide that. I won't talk about it every time, but I want you to know that there's reasons for everything we're doing, and I'm giving you the information. Okay, same thing. A boundary line that is 15 chains long. The scale is 1 inch equals 40 poles. The answer is already up. Now you see why a calculator might be used at home. Okay. So 1.5 inches equals 60 poles, which is 15 chains. Okay. Now again, this is beginning land platting, which means we have to have something to draw. We have to have information. So we'll use some really simple things to start with, but a plat is a map that is drawn to scale that shows the surveyed division of the land. That's what we're really doing, is trying to represent what the land looks like on a piece of paper, flat. Okay? It has to have a point of beginning, a place to start. It has to have definite corners of some sort, some description. There should be links and directions of the sides of the property. And then often, there will be the name of adjacent property owners, or the corner were shared by neighbors, which is very helpful to us who are doing historical research because it tells us who the neighbors are, okay? And then we're going to maybe have area and physical landmarks. That could be a creek, that could be a road, could be an old church, anything that is on the property or near the property that would help us locate the property. Surveyors still today know that people are trying to locate. That's their intent of locating a property. So today they can do GPS marking somewhat or things, but they often still will refer to a previous survey or previous work that's been done so that it can be relocated again. Now, that's called meets and bounds. Now, when I go into the rest of the country, which is not meets and bounds, people understand why we didn't adopt something different. And I explained to them that God laid out this land in meets and bounds, and that's the way it should be surveyed. Okay? I'm sorry, I'm a Tennessean deep and true, all right? So the fact that it's laid out from a rock to a creek, along the meanders to a creek to a chestnut tree, and they say that chestnut tree is gone. I don't need that chestnut tree to find the rest of a survey. And historically, surveyors have been so precise and so accurate that occasionally there are errors, and I'll show you how errors creep up. They're usually not an error of the surveyor. They're an error of somebody copying the survey who misinterpreted or misread it or just wrote it wrong. And we'll look at examples of those. So let's quickly talk about meets and bounds. And I'm going to use you in a role with that, okay? So I'm going to ask Mr. Lewis here to stand up. Will you stand up for me? All right. So he is our point of beginning. Our point of beginning, in this case, he's going to be a rock. Thank you. Okay. Just right there, just say, you can sit down. That'll be all right. I think they see where you are. From this rock, now, this is north, generally, as we're facing, okay? So that would be south. From this point, we're going to go due south, that direction. I'm going to go 20 poles. Now I'm going to just random this, and I'm going to go to the back row back there to Miss Carol. Would you stand up for me? She's trying not to be seen here today, but I want her to be seen. So, all right, so we're going from this in a true line south, 20 poles to you. Okay, does everybody see where she's standing? Okay, and she's a chestnut tree on the border with M.R. Armstrong, an old survey. Okay, now from that point, we're actually going to break off a little bit. So where you're standing, we're going back north. So from where you are, where's north? Okay, behind me. So we're going to go north, but we're going to go, so if that's north, that's what? West and east. We're going to go north, east, 45 degrees. So, all right. I know I'm moving. All right. 45 degrees. All right. Christy, you get to do something for me today. Stand up. Okay. All right. To 2 pointers and a stake on the edge of a creek. Okay. So you see where we are? We went from there to here. Right? Now we're going to go true north. 1 pole. Carol, you can sit down. Okay, all right. To the old survey corner of John Edwards. From that point, back to the beginning. Just stand back up again, Mr. Lewis. All right, now just for a split second, would my meat stand up? All right, perfect. So our property goes from here, back to there, over to here, here, and back to the beginning. Now, if you think you're lying inside that property, kind of wave your hands. Or you're on, okay. And if you're outside the property or on the line, wave your hand. Okay, here, you're on the line or in it. Depends on where. Okay, all right. Would you give my meets and bounds, my beats? Look, boss, here. All right, so that's all we're doing. We have to identify the meets, that's the corners, and then we look at the boundary or the lines between those meets. That sounds pretty simple, doesn't it? That is.
Yes.
Okay, so that's what we're going to do. In your mind now, okay, look through your notes. We're going to do it quickly, but you have lots of time. Property can be transferred in lots of ways in Tennessee. And often when we're looking for property, we may only look in one place. It can be transferred by gift, by deed, by will, through estate settlements. It can be a dower arrangement, which is a widow's life estate. It could be a grant. It could be sold for taxes or special legislative acts, or even other ones, okay? So we've got to find that document. And I'd say there are tools to find them. And I'll quickly go through this. The terms often confuse us briefly, but we'll get over it. A grantor is the person who is the seller, sometimes referred to as a conveyor. Any of those are the same thing. From is the buyer, to is the seller to the buyer, I'm sorry, from and to. The grantee is the buyer or the conveyee. Okay? And when you go, and Tennessee has great records at all the Register of Deeds offices across the state, and then here are both the historic copies of many of those property transfers, and also those estate settlements would be held often at the county court clerk now in the chancery offices across the state, or here at the State Library and Archives. We can use those records to find the deed, the transfer, or the estate of the property. Over the years, folks have created, really, I think, pretty good indexes. Any index created has the possibility that a person had a bad day and made an error. So don't get too frustrated if there's an error. Occasionally they are. If you're totally perfect, I forgive you for that, but anyway, I can't forgive me for the mistakes I've made. And basically, this tells us who's the seller. This is called a direct index. So that's the person selling property or the grantor. So John A.G. is selling to J. Robertson. That's the buyer or the grantee. And then the additional information here, it's found in Deed Book, page 6, on page 217. Okay? And if we were looking here on film, we would find what film had Deed Book 6 on it. We would go to the appropriate county, pull the film, and we could look at that deed between AG and Robertson. Does that make sense? All right, good. Also, we also have reverse indexes. And often, in some counties, the direct index is on the facing page here, and the reverse index is just on this page. So the left page is direct, the right page is reverse, except in some Kentucky counties, they're opposite. Just look at the top and see what you're looking at. If you're looking for a reverse index, make sure if it's all in one book, you don't need to read both sides, you just need to follow the page that has the reverse index. In this case, same thing. In this case, R.W. Brown is the buyer, the grantee. N.E. Armstrong is the seller. It's a deed book, page 80, book 80, page 29. Okay? You've all seen this, so you know. All I'm saying is, here's how we get to the deed. Now, occasionally, I will tell you that it's important that you look at these, that you start looking at the terminology that the indexer or the clerk who wrote these added. For example, the reference to heirs, the reference here of Dr. Raines, that's a person of color. So again, we can use those records, and not all are marked the same way. It's our job as researchers to look at the clues left to us by the folks who took the time to share this information with us, okay? Now, if there is no index, it does happen in a few places, we have several options. If we only have a direct index, we could read the direct index from A to Z, but instead of looking at the seller's column, we just read the buyers, looking for the buyers we're looking for. So if there's not a reverse, don't panic. Just say use the direct and just look at the second column. Does that make sense? That's the easy way. If there's still not some, in other places, particularly other states we go, there are not indexes for every county's records, and they're not even for some of ours, actually. We can review the individual deed books. So if we know it sold between 1845 and 1848, we could find the book that covered that time period. Maybe that deed book has an index in the front or the back, okay? Instead of the master index, there may just be one for that deed book, okay? Short of that, we can always review the deed books page by page. That's a good thing because it makes you a better researcher to read deed books. You should do that in your spare time anyway, okay? Okay, one more point and let's get to drawing. In this state, deeds had to be proven, which means there's also an entry recording most deeds and grants in the county court when they went and proved them. So even if we're missing some section, we can use the county court minute books or the order books to find where deeds were proven in open court, which would give us a date, and we can go to the appropriate book. So there's ways around all of this. There's also one other book in some counties. It's called a probate of deeds book. The word probate means to record. That's all it means, to record. So when a deed was brought in to the registrar's office, they had to do two things. One, they had to prove that the deed was authentic, and they also had to record by receiving a recording fee. Follow the money always. And their way of tracking the money that was paid to record a deed was the probated deed books, and it would be written in another docket. So this is the money that was received for this in 1843, a deed for 202 acres, and this is just who proved it in court. So it's a documentation. One of the great things about governmental work is the way that it overlaps. If one makes a mistake, somebody else copied it too. So you have a good option of seeing the truth in multiple ways, okay? All right, let's look at a basic deed. Number one, this one's typed, so if we're going back to the time period, no, they were handwritten, but this is one typed for the benefit. And here's what we're going to look for. Don't worry too much. We're looking for parties to the transaction, who was the buyer, who was the seller. We're looking at the dates both of the transaction and the date they were recorded, which is different perhaps, because we could agree to a sale on one day, but it not be recorded actually till years later, okay? I think the oldest one I know of is over in Sumner County, where there's a pre-statehood deed, a pre-statehood grant that is not recorded in the county deed book until 1963. I'm sure the person didn't want to pay the 25 cents that was required in North Carolina. Well, it would have been pounds, sorry. And the property description, and that we'll focus on that more clearly, meets and bounds is an essential part. A deed has to cover or should cover a specific piece of property in a specific location. And even when we're dealing with mortgages, which is a supplementary document to these, they do the same thing. If there's a lien or a mortgage on a piece of property, whether agricultural, or mechanics lien or whatever, it should describe precisely what's being covered. So those are another way to find the properties. So see, east 2.5 poles from 3 post oaks, the original corner. Remember what we just did with meets and bounds? Okay, let's plat a deed. Except you watch me first, okay? Remember the point of beginning, the definite corners, the lines in between, and anything related to it otherwise descriptions, okay? So, the point of beginning, and I'm going to underline this, that's beginning on a stake, that's the beginning. And if you have a photocopy of it, just do it right on the deed itself, the copy. Underline these the first time or two to get used to it. or transfer it to a piece of paper. The definite corners. So I'm just going to go through and mark all the meets in the deed I'm looking at. A stake, 3 post oaks, the original corner, a stake in W.C. Richmond's line, a walnut, a stone, a stake, and then back to the beginning. Right? Those are my meets. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's easy to see. We can see that, understand that. Okay. Then we got the links to the sides. So we're going to go east 2.5 poles. We're going to go south 12 degrees, west 168 poles. We're going to go north 66.5 degrees west, 115 poles, north 122 poles, and east 188 poles. Now, even though you don't have thought about drawing those yet, you see what's there, right? Okay. And adjoining property owners, in this case, Richmond's mentioned, and that would be important to me as a researcher, adjacent property owner. It also, area and physical landmarks. There's a reference that this is in Civil District 2, and that's important for us here in Tennessee because that's how our properties, for taxing purposes, militia districts, always, we use civil districts, not township names. Other places use townships. So Civil District 2 puts it in a particular place in that county. And that's important for us to know as we're platting the property as well. Now, you have a short form of this. It doesn't matter, it can be on plain paper, but there is, I believe it's on page 3. I just want you to see it. I am right, is it? No, it's on page 2. Bottom of page 2. And that's just a simple thing laid out showing what we would plat if we were drawing, okay? Now, you do not have to draw this one, but basically what I did under direction and calls, it started, you remember it was going east 2.5 poles, south 12 degrees west, 168 poles to a stake, W.C. Richmond, west 84 poles to a walnut. So basically all I'm doing on this is copying that information that we just looked at on one piece of paper, which 9 out of 10 times is where the error is going to be in your platting, is when you're copying it to the one sheet of paper. So we have a bad issue with transcribing problems. Maybe you don't, but the person next to you does. Okay. Now, we're not going to do math on this one, but I'm going to convert this using what I shared with you earlier, depending on the drawing scale. I want to draw this to fit on a topographic map. So basically, I'm going to take those number of poles and divide them by 121 poles to an inch to put it on the topographic map. So I'm going to draw a line 200ths, which was just almost a dot. 0.69, 0.95, 1.1. So just bear with me, I'll show you how we would do this. So whether you have a round protractor or a flat half protractor like you have, okay, let me borrow somebody's just for a second. I have a great big one that I bought specifically for this purpose, but of course it is not with me. And it's somewhere in my house, and it will be laying in front of me when I get home, but I couldn't find it for the last week, okay? When I talk about going north or south, and generally, that will be the first part of a call of a line is going north or south. If we're going to go north, we actually draw everything as though north is the top. So we would just turn our protractor north. That's north. If we're going south, we turn our protractor south. So you don't have to worry about the drawing there, north or south. If we're going to go south, and then we're going to go east, because that'll be the second step. It'll either be north, west and east, or south, west and east. And then it'll be the number of degrees. So if we're going to go south, 15 degrees east, there's 0, and we just found 15. That would be 15 degrees east. Okay? If it'd be 50 degrees west, it would be there. Okay? Does that make sense? You say that now, but in a minute you're going to say, what? Okay. Thank you, Patricia. All right. So the one we just did, that's what it's going to look like. Whether I do it on pencil, and trust me, I still do most of them on pencil, because if you know how to do this, putting them in the computer is just entering. It's going to draw it for you. But if you have an error, if it comes up and it doesn't draw right, people who have never learned to do it on pencil can't see the error. I mean, it's not they created the error, but they can't see the error in the transcription. If you learn to do it this way, you'll be able to see where there's been an error in a deed. And I'm going to show you an example of that before we get through. Okay. Remember too, property can be divided. So when we're talking about great-granddaddy's property, it could have been divided over the years, or he could have bought more property. So keep that in mind as you're doing it. Often two deeds make up the same property of the past, and we need to keep that in mind. If we think, oh, it was this big, and it's different. So only plat, and if you say that's not all his property, look for the other deed. There's probably another division. We often look for a chain of title, and almost all property in Tennessee would have been part of North Carolina. Our land, almost all of the land in this state, should go back to an original grant or an original deed. Okay? And often we're trying to find that. Go back to that original point. Now, it doesn't quite look like that when we draw them, because we're doing meets and bounds, but it's the same process. It may all go back to a part of a 640-acre grant. Okay, ignore that. Meets, corners, just think corners. Bounds, I just want you to begin to think of that. Copy them down, and that's what it would look like. That is the job. If you get that part done, if you can take a deed and get this part done, you've done 90% of it right there. So I say practice that one, get through that. Huh? So I say go work on that a week, come back, we'll pick back up tomorrow, next month. No. Ordinarily, if we do this, we do a longer period, and I make you work on this stuff a little more, but you can still do it, right? It's just I'm showing you where the points are. I want you to take that and determine. Now, if you care to resolve problems, and you're a genealogist for most of the part, that's all we do is solve problems. Often, we have something that's called closure. We have to deal with it all the time. When you draw the deed, sometimes it doesn't go back to the beginning exactly. Okay? I said exactly. Now, there is some level of allowable error, and when we draw, there's a lot of error in our drawing, but that still doesn't fit. For example, this should be a simple rectangle, 25, 100, 25, and 100, but when it's drawn, it ends up with this wide closure, and that's exactly what it says on the deed. Now, if you did this with a pencil and you say, well, wait a minute, if it's just 4 calls, it ought to go right back to that point. Okay, does that make sense? Which really, I think, is above, that's the next pay grade. So if you get this, so if we see that, the problem is, when we get to this point right here, it's probably an error in one of the calls, and if we swap, if we just think about where it would take us, if we change that one call, instead of west, it was east. That's just a copy error. The original survey, if I find it, was correct. It was just a copy error when the person was copying it, copied the deed wrong on the survey. Okay? And that's right. And generally, it's going to tell you how many acres there are to a parcel, and we can check that. So again, finding that seems to be a problem with us. A lot of deeds have errors in them, not because the survey is wrong, it was because it was copied wrong when the survey was copied or when the deed was copied into the book. That's where the error occurred. So we can solve that, generally.
Question, so is that what causes land disputes between adjacent?
Not usually. That's usually not what caused the dispute because the surveys would have been correct.
Okay,
Land disputes is maybe when two surveyors don't agree in their survey, or somebody's decided, wait a minute, my property went all the way to the river, and now the river's moved. That's what causes land disputes. Or really, my granddaddy gave me that land plus that land, but my granddaddy never owned that land. That's what causes land disputes. And all the above. All the above. Okay. All right. All right. Now, if you want to try to draw, I'm showing you the end result. Okay? Maybe that one's too hard. I want you to walk through it with me, okay? Okay, and I'm going to pull it out. You're not going to have to read the deed. So we're going to begin at a red oak. We're going to do west, so just kind of read through that for a second. Think about what you would do if I supply all the information. Okay. It's usually whittled to show that it's marking a corner. Can be on a tree. It's like a stake, except it's usually carved on a tree, a carved pointer to show. Okay. Step number 1. Before you start drawing anything on a survey, draw indicating where north is. So draw the arrow, mark it with an N. It should be the first mark on your paper. Don't put it in the middle of your paper. Put it on the edge of the paper. Now, you have to do that before because number 1, none of you are old enough that this is be a problem, but I can draw and totally forget where north is on my second draw. So I need to always have it on the paper when I start. And that's to tell people after the fact as they're seeing my drawing, but it's always there. I always write the scale, number 2, that I'm drawing to. And the scale we're going to draw to today is 1 inch equals 121 poles. So that means that's going to fit on the 7.5 minute topographic map. No, I use that if I want it to fit on a topographic map. So if I'm going to take the property and transfer it to a topographic map, a 7.5 minute topo, that's the scale to get it to fit on a topographic map. If I'm using a different map, I'm going to use a scale that makes it fit on that map. So if I'm using a modern property tax map, I'm going to draw it to the scale of that property tax map. And go back to my scale page. That's algebra again. Now, I want to say this, is that traditionally they drew beginning as either writing BEG in the old surveyors, or they drew a circle to show a beginning point. But often they would write beginning. And in fact, if you look at some of the grants, they wrote BEG and drew an arrow, drew a finger pointing at the beginning. So that's it's important enough that they did it. So we want to know where it starts, okay? The problem is you don't know where that's going to fit on a map, or you don't know how it's going to fit on the sheet of paper. We have the advantage of paper and tape. So if your drawing gets out of hand, I just say stick a piece of paper under it and tape it and keep drawing. Once you learn this, you'll kind of know what it looks like. But in the beginning, or use a 11 by 17 sheet of paper, start in the middle. You never know. You know, Tennessee has some odd-shaped property, by the way. As we move through this, I'm going to suggest that you put a little arrow showing which way you're drawing your plat to help you remember I'm drawing in this direction, okay? And you're going to write the calls and the bounds. You're going to write the bounds, those compass directions, inside the plat. Inside the plat, if it's not too tiny. Sometimes it's too tiny. And we put the meets outside on the corners. You might want to wait until you draw before you add that. If you've done that, you know that sometimes you draw it and it's too tiny and too small to see. Okay. If you're using meanders or an unsure boundary, we use a dotted line. So if it follows the meanders of the creek, that's a dotted line. It says meanders of the creek. And if we have a missing call, or that page is blank, or it's smudgy, ignore that call and start with the one following that call. So if you have 8 calls, or I'm sorry, if you know there's 8 calls and there's only 7 in the deed, you start at the one after the missing one. You draw from the missing one back around. That usually works. Just use the next call as the beginning and close where the call is missing. You'll do it. Don't worry about it yet. Okay. That's on the front of your handout. There's our one we're going to draw. Here's what we're going to draw. I'll give you the conversion. Okay? Now, if you don't want to see the next step, you can look up and down as you want to. So we're going to do this together. We're going to draw another simple one there in just a second. Okay, we're beginning at a red oak, so we're going to draw north, and we're going to draw a beginning circle. We're going to go west from our beginning, 120 poles, which is 0.99 inches, or roughly about an inch. That is west.
But if you're actually platting, you can't do roughly. You have to be specific.
Well, it is. Okay, so do 0.99 inch.
Oh, yeah, right.
Go right ahead.
I was wondering how I was going to do that. You know how to do all this. That's why I brought
He's going to teach you again. Well, he didn't need to see this. He knows how to do this. Okay, then once you do that, we're going to draw that line, 0.99. We're going to move to that position. We're not going to change our map. And by the way, later in your handout, I give you a fractional chart to show you, for example, that 5/16 is 0.3125 to help you use the decimal features to break them to English fractions. So that's in your handout as well. Now we're going north, 160 poles. So from that same dot, we just move the ruler to that dot. We're going to go north, true north, 1.32 inches. So take your ruler, mark your point, 1.32 inches, then draw the line between the 2 dots. So she ought to appreciate you even more after today. Well, this is the easy part. The surveying is much harder than doing the platting.
I'm not a surveyor, I was a surveyor's helper.
Oh,
I'm the one
you
that
held the
took
pole?
chain into the woods.
Oh, you took, well, that's the hard job too, is carrying that gunner's chain. Okay, now we have a compound call. Remember, that's going to be north, 80 degrees east. So we're going to point our half thing once we draw. So let's go back to our point up there, our period. You're going to put your protractor right on that point. Now, that one on there is a 360 one, but you're going to use, so you're going to point north, so that it'll be, sorry. You're going to point north. So your little dot's going to be right under the center point of your protractor. And you're going to go north, 80 degrees east. So you find 80 on there, put a little dot out there by it. North, 80 degrees east.
Which 80 are you talking about? I found 80 right here.
Well, it starts with 0, so it'll be 10, 20, 30.
Right there.
Oh, did I get the odd projectors?
I don't know.
Yeah, I did. Okay, all right. So for the sense of you guys not going crazy, these are, I picked these up. These are the wrong. Usually these are odd. North and south would be this line, 0 to 0. So you go north and then 80 degrees east, or north 80 degrees west. So turn them this way instead of this way.
So in this instance, 80 degrees is almost at the horizon.
Yeah, 90 degrees is this, but it's 80 degrees, so it should be somewhere.
Okay.
Yeah.
We need to be aware of that when we're buying a tractor.
Yeah, well, they all work. It's just different. Normally when we do this, sometimes we use what's called the land measure protractor, which is the 360, which is what I'm showing you there, or a clear one that has all the markings on it. But these are just like school protractors, so don't let that block you. So north 80 degrees east, north 80 degrees east, put a mark out there, then draw the line between the two dots. Okay, use your ruler to draw the bounds of the proper length. By the way, if you're drawing marks longer, erase any extra marks. Don't leave any extra marks on your paper, because somebody thinks you did it on purpose and you won't remember. Okay, we're going true south, 200 poles, which is 1.65 inches. Connect the lines. Should look something like that. Okay, let's keep going. South 200 poles, straight down. Then our next one is south 65 west. This time you're going to use your north-south. You want your protractor to point to the west. You're going to go south 65 degrees to the west. South 65 on the west side. That's right. South 65 on the west side. Put your mark. By the way, protractors, size of the protractor, sometimes if it's a small plat, you may have to make a mark and draw to it and then erase the extra marks if you've got a small protractor or a big, So that's just part of the process. It's the same. That's why I say get your protractor at home and practice a couple times. You'll get this with a little practice. And that one should be 1.32. Should have something like that at this point. Okay, this is the last call, north. So 60 poles, which should be about a ½ inch. Okay. And we'll see how good you are, how close it is. I'm going to show you some that's not close and close. So you cheated, you draw back to your, you could just draw it back to the beginning. Yeah, magnetic deviation, that always works. Magnetic deviation. But this is a good sign of your drawing capability. If it meets in every other case, but yours don't meet, see how that's off just a little bit? Then that shows that maybe you didn't measure exactly or your angles could be off. So that's part of that's our human aspect of it a little bit, okay? All right, did you get close to that? Okay, now what I usually do then, I'm going to go back and add all the notes. Inside, I'm going to add all those descriptions. Inside, I'm going to do the north 160 poles. I'm going to put all that on the inside. On the outside by the corners, I'm going to put all the meets, descriptions. If there's a property reference to somebody, I'm going to draw that in. If there's a road, I'm also going to put a citation on there as to where this original deed was. I didn't tell you at the beginning, but this is Edward Smith to David Henricks. 12th April 1846 in Smith County, deed book 4, page 126. So you could actually go look that one up, or I could attach the deed to the back of that, and that's the illustration of the property. Okay? Now, I know we live in a world of computers, and I certainly use computer images for a lot of stuff. There's a free, I actually use several platting programs, but I'm not going to recommend one, but I'm going to tell you this one. If you want to check, so what you do is you go enter it after you've drawn it, go to tract plotter, tractplotter.com. That's in your handout as well. You go in and you enter those calls. Enter the calls just like we had them typed up. If you enter them, then it will draw them. And then what you do is you go draw it first, and then you enter it in tract plotter and see if your drawing matches tract plotter. If it doesn't, then either you entered it incorrectly or you drew it incorrectly, one of the two. And by the way, if you draw it manually with a pencil and then you want to save that drawing or use it, you can actually cut using like Windows clipping tool or something. You could actually cut that image out and paste it in Word or something if you didn't want your hand drawn to show, or if you wanted it for a particular purpose. So there are ways around that. Okay? All right, now it's time for you to plat from scratch plat. So flip your paper over if you need to. Those will be blank. I tried to find the hardest one I could find. Really, because I understood that you guys were the sharpest group in the state. Right, so don't prove me wrong now. You have an engineer at home? Okay. Well, for all those folks that are watching it, they're repeating this later, you don't have to find this deed. You could go find a personal deed, one in your own family, and I suggest that you do that pretty quickly. But I'm going to give you something really fairly simple because I want you to feel successful in this, and I'll show you how to do even harder ones. It's the same process. If you can do this simple one, you can do the more complicated ones. Anything that they lay in, trust me, it couldn't be much more simple than the one I'm going to ask you to draw, okay? This is a fair assessment. Beginning at Isaac Menese's southwest corner, including the spring, there's the whole deed typed, but what I've done is I've broken it up into those sections, okay? And I would do what I told you earlier. I would actually traditionally have copied that. So I'll leave that up there. So the beginning is at Isaac Menese's southwest corner, including the spring, south 160 poles, which is 1.32 inches, to 2 black oaks, east 100 poles, 0.82683 to 2 black oaks, north 160 poles, 1.32 to a stake, and west 100 poles back to the beginning. Okay? No compound angles even. Okay, first thing you do is draw north on your paper.
Right.
Secondly, draw your scale, which will be 121 poles equal 1 inch. Yeah, so I've already done your conversion factor for you. I divided the poles by 121 to get the fractional inch measurement. Now remember, if you had a different ruler, if you had a ruler that you felt comfortable using that was in tenths, that's the advantage often to having the tenth markings. If you're using these fractional markings, it makes it's And we don't handle rulers as much as we used to probably either, so.
Well, you don't have to go to Office Depot and buy grid paper and a ruler. You can get a button measurement.
Oh, yes.
And that would be what.
I said, there's no way.
Yeah, and I wouldn't even use grid paper once you had a good ruler and a protractor. A grid paper just keeps you north and east. It helps you center. Yeah, it's not necessary. The other thing too is the reason I use a 1/4 inch grid paper, for 1/4 inch, for example, rough plats can be calculated at 30 poles a grid. And the other thing about a grid is that
You can do about 5.
you're actually calculating you actually can use that to calculate the acreage as well.
You know, oh.
But you don't need grid paper. It's just, if you don't measure well, get grid paper. Okay. I'm going to move forward anyway, okay? Still there. If you don't want to see what I'm doing, keep focusing on what you're doing, then you compare it in a minute. I'm going to go step by step. Okay, if you've drawn your fourth line, you can glance up or look up. Otherwise, it should look like that. Check your calculations. Now label your drawing, including citation. I'll have to put the citation back up for you again. No, that's not that hard, is it? Good, thank you. I bet. If you're using one of my pencils, the erasers have been overly used, so. All right. So that's what you should look at. You'll notice that if you had the deed in front of you, which you don't in this case, but it said that it was 100 acres. And so I wrote that in the center of this. And that's typically what it would look like with my drawing, my scale, and my deed. Jesse Williams to Barton Coates, Deed Book J, page 239. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Feel comfortable at this point? Okay, all right. If you went to Tract Plotter and did the same thing, that's what it would look like. Now, Tract Plotter is a free site, and I think of it as a way to check your drawing. You should not have to check a rectangular drawing, but if you wanted to do that and copy that for something you're presenting about your family or that sort of thing, then you don't need, a fancy surveying system to do that. So. Typically, and you'll see on this case it's different because Tract Plotter puts them where they want to put it. On a surveying, or if you're doing it manually, you typically put the directional calls inside, the meets or the corners on the outside. Okay. Now I'm going to show you a couple. Let's go through them. I want you to see how we would do that. I'm going to draw a couple for you just so you see the same process. And you're just going to see this is a little more complicated than the ones we've looked at. And by the way, if we've done a good job of this, if you say, I want to see those again later, if we've done a good job, you'll be able to see this again some point in the future on the Tennessee State Library and Archives website. The same, and you all, the back of your heads, will again be on that presentation. I don't know what's on there. We'll see. But this is, again, from another deed book. And step one is just break all the information, read all the meets and bounds from the deed, write them on the sheet of paper. Go back and double check, because this is where the first error is likely to do it, is you're going to copy something wrong. So do it and go back before you plat it. Okay? Notice that I've got all the descriptions out there. And if you want, when we get this up, if you'll go, you have the handout. But if you want a copy of this form, once we get this up, if you'll go back to the website when this gets up, there'll be a link to this handout and to this platting form. There's two forms, and you'll be able to download them and print all you want, okay? Or put it in whatever. If you put it in, by the way, if you do it, if you're an Excel person, you can actually set this up, type it up in Excel, and let it do your conversions for you automatically. And if you're smart enough to do that, I don't need to tell you how to do that, okay? There is a way. Okay, Step one's already in place. Do what? Draw the north arrow on your paper before you do anything else. Number two, figure out where your beginning is going to be. And basically, I'm going to go east, 224 poles, north 66 poles, west 45 poles, north 20 poles, west 34 poles, north 179 poles. Does that make sense? And when you see it like that, it's very simple. It's just step by step. All you're doing is focusing on one dot and one line, one dot and one line, one dot and one line. That's how you draw one. It's just one step at a time. You don't have to see the whole thing until you get through. So where we are up there now, we're going to go west, 37.5. We're going to go south, 183. We're going to go north, 75 west, north, 75 west, 100 poles. And then we're going to meander along a creek to the beginning. Because the creek meanders. So the line of this property, this property follows the line of a creek. And as with all water courses, they move over time. So the property line will move. It's with the meanders of the creek. It's not until we do more modern surveying where we actually survey the meander in the creek and the property line gets fixed. So often the early ones, there are meanders. Later we'll call that line down the middle of that creek. Then if that creek moves, we follow that line, not the creek. So if we're meandering, we're following the creek. If it's actually a line, we're following the line. Well, okay, it's just you asked about a river. So the issue is if the border of a river was the boundary line, at some point in time, as that river flooded into a lake, they changed the property lines either to the level of a, otherwise you go to a map prior to the lake and use it for your platting. So before the lake existed, that land's underneath it, and you still can plat just as though. Ignore the lake. We do it all the time. And then last step, survey, draw your information, add the information. Okay? Again, go check yourself on Tract Plotter if it's necessary. Okay. All right. Now I just want to show you what you've learned. I want to show you what you can do. Okay? This is just the beginning. I want you to go practice this. Let's talk about what we can do with this. Okay? We can actually take any one of these drawings and we can actually place them on a topographic map. Okay? And you would try to locate that. That means we look for an identifiable landmark, we look for a neighborhood, learn about it, and we know about the neighborhood, but often we need to learn more about the neighbors, where the schools were, in order to figure out where the property was. We want to fit it in context. And we can use all these things to add to our knowledge. But I want to show you a simple process. Now this is a deed. This is one from Robertson County's Deed Book A. That book was retyped in the 1900s. Now that is a deed from 1803 when it was recorded. That would have been originally handwritten. However, when they got typewriters in Robertson County, they were proud that they got typewriters in the deed office, and they retyped our deed books A and B. Okay? And on the last page of the retyped book, it says, and we destroyed the originals. Well, we didn't need them anymore because they were typed. Who wanted to read those all original deeds? So that was the official copy. The problem is the typing skills of somebody in 1910 aren't any better than those in 2000 and whatever year this is, okay? So there are typographic errors in the deed books now. But nonetheless, we can still draw this. And this is actually, if you're familiar with my good friend John Baker's book about the family at Wessington, this is part of the Wessington plantation, okay? So it's certainly one that folks would be using, and it's a deed from Moses Winters to Joseph Washington. And so I'm going to show you, I'm going to sketch that. That's what the property is going to look like, okay? And ultimately, if we do the same step that we just did, step by step by step, it's kind of hard to see that, but those are dots and lines connected. So if we just did the one you just drew, which is a rectangle, if we laid a sheet of mylar or polyester or even a sheet protector, or old, remember old, how many of you used to do overhead transparencies? Okay, we still have all those in our file. Pull them out. That's perfect for this. Take a marker and just sketch that property on the clear plastic. Then we're going over to a map with that shape. That one I call an eagle head. See where I get eagle head out of it? Some of you have drawn this before. I've had some people who actually did a workshop and they did it in class. I made them draw it. And then you take the topo map and then you position it where it fits. Now we know some stuff about it. We know it's on Sulphur Fork Creek, so you can look for Sulphur Fork Creek. And if you're good with eye, you already see it's right here. So it's just a matter of positioning. There's the GIS viewer. Now I have to admit, odd shapes make it easier, right? That actually fits in one place. But even that rectangle can be fit if you're looking at a neighborhood. This is actually showing current property maps. So actually, look, here's the shape of other properties nearby. So even today, I can take an existing shape and work with, so if I need to say, where does this fit? If I didn't have it, I could look at something in a neighborhood, plat that property, because I know where it fits today, and then this is an adjacent. See, we can work with the modern tools and with the old deeds to find specifically where everything was and is. So that's just where I've sketched that with a crayon or a marker, and it fits on the plat. Still kind of amazing. Still kind of amazing. There are other tools. We can do acreage. Acreage is area. So actually it's length times height if it's a rectangle. And you have the areas in your chart on the front. So 16,000 square poles is an acre. Okay. 16,000 square poles. So 1 acre is 160 square poles. So we just do the math. I did used to be a math teacher. I wasn't a very good math teacher, but I was a math teacher once. We could take a complex plat like the one we just drew and break it down into rectangles and triangles and calculate it, that's the way surveyors did it in the past, but to break it into mathematical calculable areas. Then we calculate the area and add them all together. And if you look in a field book of a surveyor, and many of our county surveyors' books survive, if you will look, you will find these calculations on a page or on the right-hand side of the drawings that they've created. So go look for those. You'll be amazed how many of those are there. And they'll show you exactly how they do things. I've given you both of these. This is genealogytools.net. They do just like what Tract Plotter did, but I'm going to suggest that the easier one, it's in your handout, this one is Tract Plotter. Hold on. Tract Plotter, you just type it in the text, just like I want you to copy it on a sheet of paper to start with. That's exactly what you type in there. Notice poles are there, the P, exactly the way you would do it. Okay, tractplotter.com. Then hit submit, show labels. If you want it to show the notes or turn that off, precision's just going to mean it's going to close for you if it doesn't close automatically, and that's what it looks like. So it's a great place to check your work. We don't know, in that way you can do it by yourself. You can practice this, go punch it in Tract Plotter and say, yes, it does work. It is exactly the way it should be. Do be aware, though, as we do this, that many of our counties do have property ownership maps that we can use as references to locations. This happens to be a Sumner County District 15 map, but those are available here some at the county, but always check. Look at the map collection here, which is wonderful. And particularly, a few of these are actually available. Some of the maps are available at the Library of Congress for this area, but most of the ones that are there are here as well. So always check here first. If we're going to copy references, there are lots of ways to extract this data of the deeds. Because if we find one deed, we want to look, well, if they bought it, when did they sell it? Or vice versa. So we're going to look for other information. Assessors of property today have done us a great service, and that we can go to this real estate assessment data location for the state. If you forget this, type Tennessee tax assessor. This will pop up. And we can locate current property owner information in comparative format. You can actually click on the appropriate county, or you can choose the county from the list. Once there, you can search by either the address or property owner, or by map and parcel number. Okay, so all this has been worked out. Accessible access. And by the way, all the folks in the counties know how to use this. If you ask, they'll usually help you and point you along appropriately. Austin P also has a GIS website group where they've worked with some of the counties, have an additional cross-referencing of information as well. But now the county maps are all up, so I tend to go straight to the property tax. Right? Okay, this is my brother's property, and with the drawing, I can go back to the drawing itself. Notice I have turned on the overlay of the map underneath, so we can actually look at the woods. For those of us that are looking at cemeteries often, and we're looking for property and where a cemetery may have been on property, then we can go straight to the property ownership map and look at this and often determine who's the current property owner if we know where the cemetery is. Or determine where in that plat is the most likely place for a cemetery to lie. How would I do that, for example? Well, number one, if you've grown up in this area, you tend to know where cemeteries are. So it's not in the middle of in my family, they would always buried in the middle of the best tillable field, which means let's got to plow around those graves, or they're gone. Okay, so they're tending to be in a higher location, reserved to the side. And remember the time period they're created. That's another. We could go another 2 hours on that one. So but do you know there's the way of thinking about where and how they were created. You can identify adjacent property owners. So in that case, I will tell you there's a cemetery right there. So we can see that's on the center of this, and we can actually look at the tax card for that person right there. Find out who the owner is, the address, and move forward. Again, we can search by address, by name, by parcel number, okay, by all the counties in Tennessee. Remember too, many of our counties, if you're looking at deeds, have property cross-index cards. As we went from maps, or we went from no maps to maps, assessors of property and had to, across the state, figure out where the property was. They had to track it. They had to know who the owners were. Those maps weren't created overnight, and they were created by the drawing over aerial maps of plats of property based on the current property owners. Those historically might be housed in your county's archives. And or oh, it varied by county. I'm sorry, it varied by county.
1800s.
No, do you know when Cheatham County started using property tax maps, say 1910, 20? They started doing them right after. We have aerial photos in 1900. So as soon as we've got aerial photo maps, they started mapping property out because that's resolving the issues with whose property is this and where's the line. Yeah. So remember, the cross-index cards occur. And this is one of my favorites. And Carol Roberts helped me with this. I'll give her a little credit on this. This is an old piece of a house that actually set out on Nolensville Road. And the determination was whether it was historic property. And often, the way with modern information is we have to do just what you and I have done. We have to track where it was located, and what it compares with a modern map. I'll try to do this fairly quickly, but basically, historically, there was a Chancery Court case over the John Page estate, and there was a drawing. The house that we're looking for actually is that house. It's the Williams house. Whoops, right there. Okay? So what I started doing is doing exactly what you did. Went through every deed related to all the earlier property of that and surrounding it, and I drew it. Now I'm laying it over modern property map, but you see the drawing that I made, just like what we just did, from dot to dot to dot to dot to dot. Okay? Looks the same thing. It's just, okay. And I drew every deed. The property surrounding the house was set apart in a Chancery Court case in 1958. The smaller tract where the house was conveyed in 1973 for $10. The current owner paid $525,000 for that house. And in the process of looking at that, we're able to show all the deeds of that family on a modern map, where they lay, and there's even an overlap. That's the creek, all the acreage. Now, there was an error in one of their deeds, and one of the deeds didn't cover all of the area, and that was part of the problem over the years, is that one of the deeds went like this. And what happened is, when it got right here, instead of sending this call out here and down, it did this. And this was the road. There was a call missing on the deed. And that's the property, and there's the house. And when you find the house, and there's the people. So that's the family, the Williams family, that owned that property, and the Perkins connections in that property. So when you find the property and you learn about the house and you learn about the people, then that's the story that comes out of platting. Platting is about the land, but the platting is about the story of the family. And in order to find the story of the family, finding the specific piece of property is often essential. So what I've taught you today is the first step. Do not let this be the last step. The next step would be find the deeds of interest of you, then try platting them. If you have issues or questions, you have my email. I'd be glad to entertain simple questions about it. But more than that, know that you have a staff of folks here at the Tennessee State Library and Archives who understand the value of land in their records, and they're always here to come and answer your questions, or if they don't, they know how to find me, and they all know how to find me. Trust me. So anyway, thank you guys for being here. Be glad to answer questions later, but thanks you guys. Appreciate it. Have a great day.